Don't bother with the manifest, just fire. The order hung in the command deck of the Ythrani cruiser, Venom's kiss like smoke that wouldn't clear. Inquisitor Dren didn't look up from his tactical display. His venom sacs pulsed beneath his jaw, a biological tell that his subordinates had learned to read as satisfaction. Outside the viewport, the medical transport Hippocrates' hand drifted in the shadow of Ethan Prime's third moon. It was a civilian vessel. The markings were unmistakable: the red crescent of neutral aid, the registration codes that declared it unarmed, the hull configuration that spoke of cargo holds filled with surgical equipment and refrigerated blood stores rather than munitions. It had been broadcasting a rescue beacon for 6 hours, ever since its drive core suffered what the Ythrani jamming arrays had induced. A cascade failure that left it dead in the void, life support guttering, 247 souls waiting for salvation that would not arrive. Dren's second, a junior officer named HFY, felt his own venom sacs tighten with something else. Inquisitor, the vessel is broadcasting on emergency frequencies. Council protocols for... The council protocols, Dren interrupted, still not looking up, were written for species who matter. He finally turned. His eyes, compound and faceted, caught the bridge lighting in ways that made them appear to contain small, angry stars. Do you know what the tide is, HFY? The tide, Inquisitor. The tide is the movement of water on primitive worlds. It comes in, it goes out, it does not negotiate, it does not care about the sandcastles built by children. Dren gestured toward the viewport. Their tears are just drops in our tide, fire. The Venom's kiss discharged its forward batteries, not the heavy cannons reserved for military targets. That would have been wasteful. Just the point defense arrays, sufficient to shred a civilian hull like teeth through membrane. The Hippocrates' hand did not explode dramatically. It simply came apart, sections of hull peeled away. The surgical ward, visible through a viewport that suddenly had no viewport, vomited its contents into vacuum. Beds, equipment, a flailing shape in medical scrubs that HFY would see when he closed his eyes for cycles to come. The cold preserved everything. There would be no burning, just breaking, just the slow, frozen dispersal of what had been a ship, a crew, a mission of mercy. Scan for survivors, Dren said, already turning back to his display. Minimal effort. Log any distress beacons. We'll need to know which frequencies to jam when the next one arrives. The rescue beacon, PS-23, continued broadcasting. It was a simple device, mass-produced by the thousand, designed to function even when nothing else did. It transmitted on a frequency reserved for unarmed civilian vessels in extremis. It carried the Hippocrates' hands registry, its manifest of medical supplies, its crew complement, and its final coordinates. It would continue broadcasting until its power cell failed in approximately 300 years or until someone retrieved it. Dren's laughter when the signal registered on his board was not cruel. It was worse. It was casual. Another drop, he said. Note the frequency. Someone else might try to answer. What happened next? I wish I could say it ended there. Stay close. The message reached Greer within minutes, not the attack. The attack was already 47 minutes old by the time the data packet crossed the light speed gap to the Deep Space Rescue Coordination Station Beacon's Hope. The packet traveled by unconventional means. A Vrethian diplomatic courier, small and fast and willing to risk the Ythrani blockade rather than trust standard channels. 17 cycles vanished, watched the packet download with membrane skin that refused to settle. The Vrethian attaché had been stationed on the Beacon's Hope for 3 cycles, serving as economic liaison between his species and the human rescue networks that kept the Vrethian homeworld supplied with antibiotics, surgical equipment, and the membrane-stabilizing drugs that prevented their fragile integument from drying out in the harsh conditions of space travel. He had learned to read human expressions. He had learned that humans smiled when they were angry, that they became very still when they were afraid, that their voices dropped lower when the stakes were highest. Greer did not look up from her console when he entered her office. She was 43 years old, with hair the color of spent fuel rods and hands that moved across her interface with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years coordinating rescues in the deep dark. Her family had died in the last silence, the one that had no name because the Ythrani didn't bother to name their atrocities when the victims were species who, as Dren would say, did not matter. She had been 16. She had sworn never to be helpless again. "Attaché," she said, her voice never rose above conversational volume, "you've brought me something." 17 cycles vanished, extended his data appendage, the membrane skin of his forelimb parting to reveal the secure crystal. The Hippocrates Hand, 247 souls, medical transport, unarmed, civilian registry. His voice, filtered through the translator, carried the wet clicking sounds of Vrethian distress. Inquisitor Dren. Ythrani cruiser Venom's kiss. They fired on the distress beacon, they laughed. Greer took the crystal. She did not insert it immediately. Instead, she turned it in her fingers, examining the faceted surface as if she could read its contents through her skin. You risk much to bring this. The Vrethian people depend on human medical infrastructure. If the Ythrani destroy your ships with impunity, my species. 17 cycles vanished, membrane skin rippled, a gesture that translated roughly as the future becomes uncertain. We are not warriors, our economy is trade, our bodies are fragile. We cannot survive without the supply lines your coordinators maintain. And yet you came personally, not through diplomatic channels, not through the Council's approved communication networks. The Council approved the attack. The words came out flat, stripped of their usual Vrethian tonal courtesy. Or they will call it a regrettable incident. They will form a committee. They will determine that the Hippocrates Hand was in restricted space, that its beacon frequency interfered with Ythrani military operations, that 247 deaths are acceptable when weighed against Council security concerns. 17 cycles vanished. Secondary heart, the one that regulated his emotional state, began to pulse irregularly. I could not let the data be sanitized. I could not let the names become statistics. Greer inserted the crystal. The files bloomed across her display, the beacon recording, the hull camera footage, the crew manifest, the final transmissions. She watched the Hippocrates Hand come apart in silence. Her expression did not change. Her hands did not tremble. But 17 cycles vanished, who had learned to read human stillness, saw something in the set of her shoulders that made his primary heart constrict. We learned this after the last extinction event, Greer said. She spoke as if commenting on weather, the one that had no name. She keyed a sequence into her console, not an emergency broadcast, not a military alert, something else. 17 cycles vanished recognized some of the routing codes. They were logistics channels, supply chain management systems, the mundane infrastructure that moved medical cargo between stars. Other codes he did not recognize. They were older, deeper. What are you doing? He asked. Greer turned to face him for the first time. Her eyes were the color of ice on a failed life support system. Coordinating a rescue, she said. The Hippocrates Hand is still broadcasting. 247 souls require evacuation. They're dead. I watched the footage. I brought you the footage. The beacon continues to broadcast. The beacon determines the priority. The priority determines the response. Greer's fingers moved across her interface and 17 cycles vanished, saw something that made his membrane skin attempt to contract in a defensive posture that evolution had never quite finished providing. The routing codes were spreading. Not to one ship, not to 10, to hundreds. To a network that spanned the sector, that touched every human-coordinated rescue station, that reached into supply depots and medical warehouses, and the civilian transport lanes that the Ythrani had never bothered to monitor because they were merely humanitarian infrastructure. You cannot declare war on the tide, Greer said. She was not speaking to him. She was not speaking to anyone in the room. Her voice remained conversational, almost gentle, as if she were explaining a supply requisition to a new assistant. The tide does not care about your fleets. The tide does not care about your borders. The tide comes in because that is what water does. 17 cycles vanished, felt his translator struggle with the metaphor. I do not understand. You are a rescue coordinator. You have no military authority. The Ythrani. The Ythrani, Greer interrupted, and for the first time her voice carried something that might have been steel beneath the softness, have spent 300 years purchasing military hardware from human manufacturers. They have spent 300 years accepting human engineering into their supply chains. They have spent 300 years assuming that a species obsessed with saving life would never contemplate the alternative. She turned back to her console. They were half right. The first responses began arriving, not warships. The codes that Greer had activated did not route to warships. They routed to medical frigates, to evacuation transports, to the heavy-lift cargo haulers that normally carried field hospitals and disaster relief supplies. They routed to the Madison Sans Limits, the Florence Nightingale IX, the Unconditional, ships with red crescents on their hulls, ships registered as unarmed civilian vessels. Ships that 17 cycles vanished realized with a sensation like falling through his own feet were responding to the same beacon that Dren had laughed at. The Hippocrates hand broadcast on frequency 847. 3, Greer said. All human coordinated rescue vessels monitor 847. 3. All human manufactured equipment manufactured after the last extinction event contains a secondary receiver for 847. 3. The Ythrani never asked why, they only asked if the price was competitive. She pulled up a sector map. The Venom's kiss appeared as a red icon near the debris field that had been a medical transport. Around it, other icons began to bloom, the green of rescue vessels, the blue of supply ships, the white of medical coordination networks. They were not approaching in attack formation. They were not approaching in any formation at all. They were simply converging, responding to a beacon, doing what they had been designed to do. The Venom's kiss will detect them soon, 17 Cycles Vanished said. They will fire, they are Ythrani, they fire on unarmed vessels. Yes, Greer agreed, they do. She entered another sequence. The sector map shifted, displaying not rescue coordination but something else, technical schematics, manufacturing codes, supply chain records. 17 Cycles Vanished recognized the Ythrani military designations. He recognized the human manufacture codes. He recognized the integration points where human engineering had been incorporated into Ythrani systems to reduce costs, to improve efficiency, to maintain the delicate balance of council politics that kept the Ythrani powerful and the humans helpful. The targeting arrays on the Venom's kiss, Greer said. Human manufacture. Series 7 manufactured in the Proxima yards, the same series installed on every Ythrani cruiser built in the last 80 years. The same series that responds to frequency 847. 3. When that frequency is broadcast with certain modifications. 17 Cycles Vanished felt his secondary heart stop entirely. You built kill switches into their weapons. We built rescue coordination into their weapons. Greer corrected him without heat. The Series 7 targeting array was designed to prioritize civilian distress signals. To avoid firing on medical transports, to protect the vulnerable. The Ythrani requested that feature be disabled for their military applications. We disabled the user interface. We did not disable the hardware. She turned to face him fully. They have been firing on ghosts for 3 hours. Every targeting solution they have attempted since the Hippocrates hand began broadcasting has been automatically redirected to the beacon source. They have been firing at a signal that no longer has a ship attached to it. They have been revealing their position, their capabilities, their willingness to commit atrocity to every rescue vessel in the sector. 17 Cycles Vanished stared at the map. The green icons continued to converge. There were hundreds now. Thousands, if you counted the automated supply drones and the emergency response platforms and the mobile surgical units that had been stationed at neutral ports throughout the sector, waiting for disasters that had never come. The Vrethian homeworld alone hosted 47 such units, maintained at human expense, staffed by human medical personnel, protected by treaties that the Ythrani had signed without reading because they were merely humanitarian agreements. You cannot declare war on the tide, Greer said again. You can only decide where you stand when it arrives. She reached for her broadcast console. I am going to speak to Inquisitor Dren now. I am going to offer him the right to surrender. He does not have the right to negotiate. I would like you to witness this, attaché. I would like your species to witness this. The Vrethian economy depends on human trade, yes, but it also depends on human restraint. You should see what happens when that restraint is withdrawn. 17 Cycles Vanished felt his membrane skin settle at last, though not into comfort, into the resigned texture of a being who has committed to a course and can only hope the water is deep enough. We will witness, he said. We will offer docking rights to your rescue armada. We will offer fuel. We will offer intelligence. We will offer everything. Greer's hand paused above the broadcast control. For a moment, something moved behind her eyes that might have been grief, or might have been memory, or might have been the simple exhaustion of someone who had spent 20 years preparing for a moment she had prayed would never arrive. The last extinction event, she said, taught us that help and dominance must be the same system, that you cannot protect the vulnerable without the power to punish their predators. The galaxy thought we were building a medical network. She pressed the control. We were building a nervous system. The broadcast opened. The Venom's kiss appeared on her display, its commander visible in the tactical feed that the Ythrani cruiser didn't know was being shared with 300 rescue coordination stations across the sector. Dren's compound eyes caught the light like angry stars. He was laughing at something his second had said, some joke about the debris field, some comment about drops in the tide. Greer began to read the names of the dead. It would take 4 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The frequency carried. Dren stopped laughing. The sound died in his throat like a small animal caught in a trap. His compound eyes, which had been tracking the debris field with the casual satisfaction of a predator surveying a successful kill, suddenly fixed on his tactical display with an intensity that made his subordinates step backward. The screen showed what it had been showing for 3 hours, the rescue beacon, PS-23, broadcasting from coordinates that no longer contained a ship. But now, overlaid on that signal, was something else. Hundreds of somethings. Green icons blooming across the sector map like a contagion, like a disease spreading faster than any biological agent, like rescue vessels, Kesvar said, his voice carrying the flat disbelief of someone reading a label that refused to match the contents. Medical transports, civilian registration, they're converging on our position. Jam the frequency, Dren ordered. His venom sacs pulsed, but the rhythm was wrong now, stuttering, irregular. Jam all frequencies in the 847 range, now. The jamming arrays are already active, Inquisitor. They have been since we engaged the target. Then why are they still coming? Kesvar's hands moved across his console, pulling technical readouts that his species had not designed, that his engineers had purchased from human manufacturers because the price was competitive and the integration was seamless, and the humans were merely builders of medical equipment and agricultural systems, and the soft infrastructure of civilization that warriors did not need to understand. The Series 7 targeting arrays, he said, and his voice had gone very small, very wet, very Vrethian in its distress. They're responding to the beacon. They're prioritizing it there. They're designed to avoid firing on medical transports, Inquisitor. The hardware won't lock. The software won't execute. The arrays keep redirecting to the beacon source. Dren struck him, not with thought, not with strategy, but with the simple physical reflex of a species that had evolved to dominate through venom and terror. Kesvar stumbled, his jaw clicking where the mandible had cracked, his own venom sacs contracting in submission patterns that his biology could not suppress. Manual override, Dren hissed. Bypass the Series 7. Fire on the rescue vessels. Fire on everything. The override requires Council authorization codes. The codes are transmitted through the same arrays. The arrays are. They're not accepting the transmission, Inquisitor. They're treating it as a secondary distress signal. They're prioritizing the beacon. How long had the Ythrani been firing on ghosts? Greer's voice continued through the broadcast channel, reading names that Dren could not hear because his audio systems had automatically filtered civilian frequencies as non-threatening, as irrelevant, as drops in a tide that did not concern him. But the Vrethian diplomat heard, the rescue coordinators heard, the network heard. 17 cycles vanished, felt his secondary heart resume its irregular rhythm, pounding against his fragile sternum with a force that threatened to tear his membrane skin from the inside. He watched Greer's face as she read, her voice never rising, never breaking, never offering the emotional release that his Vrethian physiology craved. She was not performing grief. She was demonstrating it. Showing how a species learned to carry the dead without collapsing, to speak their names without screaming, to make the weight of loss into a weapon sharper than any blade. Marcus Chen, she said, emergency physician, specialized in membrane trauma, had been scheduled to rotate to the Vrethian homeworld next cycle. Yuki Tanaka, she said, surgical nurse, kept a garden in the hydroponics bay, grew flowers that only bloomed in Earth-standard atmosphere. David Akafer, she said, supply coordinator, was teaching himself Vrethian trade protocols, wanted to understand the people he was helping. The names continued. 4 minutes, 247 souls, each one a drop in a tide that Dren had thought he commanded, that he had believed would recede at his approach, that he had never understood was not water at all but something else entirely. The accumulated weight of every human who had ever watched someone die and sworn never to be helpless again. On the tactical display, the green icons continued to converge. They were not warships. They would not fire. They did not need to. They were simply present, overwhelming the Ythrani targeting systems with legitimate civilian contacts, flooding the tactical picture with more rescue beacons than any military computer could prioritize, creating a sensor environment where the Venom's kiss could not distinguish between threat and victim because the humans had erased the distinction. You cannot declare war on the tide, Greer said, and this time she was speaking to Dren directly, her voice carrying on the frequency that his systems could no longer filter, that his hardware prioritized above his own commands. You can only decide where you stand when it arrives. She paused, the silence stretched across the light speed gap, across the debris field, across the void where the Hippocrates hand had been. When she spoke again, her voice carried the absolute finality of water finding its level. You have the right to surrender. You do not have the right to negotiate. Dren's response was not words, it was fire. Desperate, uncoordinated, the Venom's kiss discharged every weapons system that would still respond, targeting the green icons, targeting the debris field, targeting the beacon itself with a fury that recognized its own impotence. The shots went wide. The Series 7 arrays, interpreting the energy discharge as potential collateral damage to civilian vessels, automatically adjusted the firing solutions away from the rescue ships, toward the only target that contained no life signs, no legitimate beacon, no protected status. The debris of the Hippocrates hand itself. The Ythrani cruiser fired on empty space, on frozen corpses, on the ghosts of the dead while the living gathered around it like mourners around a grave. You have exactly one chance to reconsider, Greer said. This is it. The deadline passed, not with an explosion, not with a broadcast ultimatum. Simply with the continued convergence of the rescue fleet, the steady accumulation of witnesses, the inexorable arithmetic of a network that had been designed to save lives and had been turned, with the simple adjustment of a frequency, into a mechanism of absolute accountability. Dren watched his tactical display as the Venom's Kiss's power systems began to fluctuate, not from attack. From the simple physical reality of maintaining weapons readiness beyond design specifications, of forcing hardware to operate against its fundamental programming, of the accumulated stress of a ship that had been firing on ghosts for hours while its life support, its navigation, its communications all degraded under the load. The beacon, Kesvar whispered. He had not moved from his station, had not sought medical attention for his cracked mandible, had not done anything except watch his instruments with the fatalism of a species that understood, finally, what it meant to be fragile. It's changed, Inquisitor, the signal. It's not broadcasting a distress call anymore. Dren turned. His compound eyes, which had caught light like angry stars, now reflected only the flat glow of a tactical display that showed what he had failed to understand until this moment. The beacon, PS-23, had stopped requesting help. It had begun transmitting coordinates. Fixed coordinates, precise coordinates, targeting coordinates. The rescue fleet did not fire. They did not need to. They simply parted, their green icons shifting position with the coordinated grace of a medical evacuation, creating a corridor through slipspace that had not existed moments before. And through that corridor, moving with the inevitability of diagnosis following symptom, came the human armada. Not warships. The distinction mattered. These were heavy rescue platforms, mobile surgical centers, emergency response vessels scaled for planetary disaster. They were the ships that had evacuated the Vrethian homeworld during the Membrane Plague. They were the ships that had established the refugee camps on Proxima IV. They were the ships that had been built to save lives, and they were arriving at coordinates that a beacon had designated as requiring their presence. The Venom's Kiss could not target them. The Series 7 arrays, recognizing the civilian registration codes, the medical markings, the rescue beacons that every ship carried, refused to lock. The manual overrides routed through the same systems were interpreted as distress signals and prioritized below the beacon's targeting data. The Ythrani cruiser, for all its military design, its venom-based weaponry, its terror tactics, and its council authority, was functionally disarmed by the simple presence of too many civilians who would not leave. Greer's voice, when it came again, carried no triumph, only the exhausted satisfaction of a coordinator who had watched her network function exactly as designed. The tide came in, she said. It will not recede until you are no longer standing in its path. Dren looked at his hands. They were shaking. He did not know when they had started. Surrender, he said. The word tasted like poison, like admitting that his venom was not the most potent substance in the galaxy, that his terror tactics had encountered something that did not frighten. Unconditional, Greer agreed. Your ship will be boarded by medical personnel. Your crew will be treated for any injuries sustained during your malfunction. You will be transported to a human-coordinated detention facility where you will await trial for crimes against civilian populations. The Council will be notified that their military hardware contains certain features that they did not request and that we did not advertise. They may choose to continue purchasing human engineering with full knowledge of its capabilities. Or they may choose to develop their own systems at their own expense with their own vulnerabilities. She paused. The Vrethian people have offered docking rights to our rescue armada. They have offered fuel. They have offered intelligence. They have offered everything. This is what the tide looks like, Inquisitor, not water, simply the direction that help flows when you remove the obstacles that prevent it. The broadcast ended. 17 cycles vanished remained in Greer's office, his membrane skin finally settling into a texture that he did not have a name for, something between awe and grief and the terrible recognition of what his species had allied with, what they had depended on, what they had never understood. You built this, he said, all of it, the medical networks, the supply chains, the rescue infrastructure. You built it knowing that someday. Knowing that someday someone would attack the helpless, Greer finished. Yes. We learned that after the last extinction event, the one that had no name. She stood. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of someone who had carried a weight for 20 years and was only now, perhaps, setting it down. The Ythrani will surrender, the council will bluster. There will be committees, investigations, political consequences that I do not have the patience to navigate. Other humans will handle that. I am a rescue coordinator. My job is finished when the survivors are safe. There were no survivors, 17 cycles vanished, said. From the Hippocrates' hand, you know this, I know this, the beacon. The beacon continues to broadcast, Greer said. It will continue for 300 years, it will continue until someone retrieves it. And now, thanks to your courage in bringing me that data, the entire sector knows its location. The entire sector knows what happened there. The entire sector knows that when you attack a human medical transport, you do not face a military response. You face something else entirely. You walk to the viewport. Outside, the rescue fleet continued to arrive, green icons blooming across the darkness like something growing, like something alive, like the nervous system of a galaxy finally learning to feel pain in its extremities and respond. You asked what the tide is, she said, not turning. I will tell you. The tide is the accumulated weight of every human who ever watched someone die and chose to build something instead of surrendering. It is the medical transport that arrives at the plague world. It is the surgical team that works through the radiation exposure. It is the supply coordinator who learns Vrethian trade protocols because he wants to understand the people he is helping. It is everything that the Ythrani dismissed as weakness, as softness, as merely humanitarian. She turned. Her eyes were the color of ice on a failed life support system, and they held something that 17 cycles vanished finally recognized. Not cruelty, not vengeance, but the absolute, uncompromising determination of a species that had decided, collectively and irrevocably, that help and dominance would be the same system. That you could not protect the vulnerable without the power to punish their predators. That the only way to ensure that rescue beacons were answered was to make the consequences of ignoring them unbearable. The tide does not hate you, Greer said. It does not love you, it simply comes in because that is what water does, and you can only decide where you stand when it arrives. She walked away from the viewport. Her footsteps echoed in the silence of the office, each one deliberate, measured, the gait of someone who had spent 20 years preparing for a moment and was now, finally, moving past it. She did not look back at the tactical display. She did not look back at the Vrethian diplomat. She did not look back at the viewport where the rescue fleet gathered around the coordinates that a beacon had designated, the debris field that had been a ship, the grave that had no bodies because they had frozen and scattered and become part of the void. She walked through the door. It closed behind her with a sound like a seal engaging, like an airlock cycling, like the final punctuation of a sentence that had taken 20 years to write. 17 cycles vanished remained. He watched the display. He watched the Venom's kiss power down its weapons, open its docking ports, surrender to the medical personnel who would treat its crew with the same professionalism they would bring to any disaster. He watched the beacon PS-23 continue broadcasting its coordinates, no longer a plea for help but a statement of presence, a declaration of location, a fixed point in the void that said here and enough and never again. The Vrethian homeworld would offer docking rights. They would offer fuel. They would offer everything. They would do this because they were fragile, because their membrane skin required human drugs, because their economy required human trade, because they had watched a species that they had thought was soft reveal itself to be something else entirely. Not hard, not cruel, but inevitable. He thought of Greer's footsteps echoing in the silence. He thought of the names she had read, 4 minutes of the dead, 247 souls who had become part of the tide. He thought of Dren's compound eyes, which had caught light like angry stars and now reflected only the flat glow of defeat. The beacon continued to broadcast. 3 days later, a salvage vessel retrieved it from the debris field. The crew reported that its hull bore a single word, painted in emergency sealant by someone who had known they were dying and had wanted the galaxy to understand. Enough. The salvage crew brought it to the beacon's hope. Greer was no longer aboard. She had transferred to a different station, a different sector, a different set of coordinates where help might be needed and preparation might be required. But the beacon remained. It was installed in the station's memorial gallery, still broadcasting on frequency 847. 3, still transmitting coordinates that no longer required rescue. Visitors would stand before it. They would read the word. They would wonder if it was a statement of exhaustion or a declaration of limit, if it meant we have had enough or you have done enough or simply this ends here. The beacon did not answer. It simply continued as it had been designed to do, functioning beyond the destruction of its ship, beyond the death of its crew, beyond the moment that had required its use. It broadcast for 300 years as its power cell had promised. And in all that time, no Ythrani cruiser fired on an unarmed human medical transport. No Inquisitor laughed at a distress signal. No one who understood what the tide meant chose to stand in its path.